The sun had barely risen over Washington, D.C., yet the city already felt tense. Outside the U.S. Capitol, journalists gathered in clusters, cameras rolling, waiting for a statement that might never come. Inside, the air was heavy with frustration and exhaustion. The government shutdown had entered its second week. What began as a routine budget debate had now grown into one of the most serious political standoffs in modern American history. The federal government, the beating heart of the nation, had come to a standstill. Thousands of federal employees were home without pay, offices were locked, and the usually bustling Capitol was wrapped in a strange silence. But beneath that silence, anger simmered. At the core of the crisis lay deep ideological divisions. Healthcare funding, immigration spending, and the question of how much power the federal government should truly hold. For many, it wasn't just about money. It was about identity, values, and the direction of America itself. President Donald Trump, standing firm at the White House, insisted he would not back down. He claimed his plan would protect taxpayers and restore financial discipline. Democrats, however, accused him of holding the country hostage for political gain. Neither side was willing to blink first, and as each day passed, ordinary citizens were paying the price. Across the nation, families of government workers were cutting costs. National parks and museums were closed. Passport services had stopped, and in hospitals and schools that relied on federal funding, anxiety was spreading fast. Economists warned that if the shutdown continued, it could cost billions each week. But for now, the political deadlock seemed unbreakable, a chess game between two powers determined not to lose. And while America waited, the world watched closely, wondering how long the most powerful democracy on earth could remain frozen by its own divisions. As the days dragged on, the mood in Washington grew darker. Inside Congress, heated debates echoed through empty halls. Republican and Democratic leaders met behind closed doors, yet every meeting seemed to end the same way, with raised voices and no agreement. The issue at the heart of it all was clear. Republicans wanted to reduce federal spending, especially in programs like Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. They argued that government aid had grown too large, too costly, a burden for the next generation. Democrats, on the other hand, saw it differently. They believed cutting healthcare funding now would endanger millions of low-income families and dismantle years of social progress. Each side claimed to fight for the American people, but the people themselves were suffering. More than 800,000 federal employees were furloughed without pay. Some lined up at food banks for the first time in their lives. Others took temporary jobs to survive. In small towns across the country, the effects rippled outward. Local businesses that relied on government contracts began to lose money. Families postponed vacations, car purchases, even rent payments. The once distant idea of a shutdown had suddenly become very real, touching homes in every state. Meanwhile, the media covered every moment relentlessly. Television networks ran live updates, talk shows argued day and night, and social media burned with outrage. Supporters of both parties clashed online, one side blaming reckless spending, the other condemning political cruelty. The nation was not just divided in policy, it was divided in spirit. And in the middle of it all stood President Trump. To some, he was a symbol of strength, a leader finally standing up to Washington bureaucracy. To others, he was the architect of chaos, a man willing to risk everything for political dominance. In a late-night address from the Oval Office, Trump declared, "I will not sign any bill that sells out the American taxpayer. We need a leaner, stronger government that works for the people, not for the politicians." His words struck sharply through the nation. Applauded by his base, condemned by his critics. The standoff had become more than a budget battle. It was a test of power, pride, and endurance. Outside, the lights of the Capitol still glowed in the night. But inside, the machinery of government remained frozen, waiting for someone, anyone, to make the first move. By the third week of the shutdown, tension in Washington had reached a breaking point. The optimism that once fueled negotiations had vanished. Now, lawmakers avoided the press, slipping quietly through corridors lined with reporters shouting questions that no one dared to answer. In the streets outside, protesters gathered every day. Some carried signs demanding "Fund the government now." Others called for accountability, "Stop the waste, save our taxes." Voices clashed in the cold October air, echoing across the marble steps of the Capitol. For many Americans, patience was running thin. Their savings were drying up, their bills were piling higher. Government workers, from air traffic controllers to medical researchers, were uncertain when they would next be paid. Even airport security lines had grown longer as unpaid officers called in sick or quit altogether. News anchors began to call it the crisis of the people, because it wasn't the politicians who were suffering most. It was the teachers waiting on federal grants, the soldiers' families living paycheck to paycheck, and the small business owners losing government contracts overnight. Yet amidst the frustration, there was still hope for compromise. A bipartisan group of senators quietly began meeting in secret, trying to draft a temporary funding bill that could reopen the government for at least 30 days. But even that fragile plan faced threats from both sides. Hardline conservatives called it a surrender, while progressives called it too weak. Meanwhile, the president's tone began to harden. He took to social media daily, attacking his opponents and accusing Democrats of sabotaging America. His words fueled his supporters but deepened the political divide. Every tweet made headlines, and every headline pushed the nation closer to anger and exhaustion. Still, deep inside the White House, advisors worried. The economic fallout was growing. Markets were jittery, consumer confidence was falling, and international investors were beginning to question the stability of the U.S. government. Behind the scenes, even some within Trump's own party had begun to whisper, "How long can we really keep this going?" But no one dared to say it out loud. Not yet. Mid-October, Washington had turned into a battlefield of words. The marble buildings stood tall and silent, but inside, tempers were boiling. Every hallway of Congress carried the echoes of blame. Republicans accusing Democrats of reckless spending, and Democrats accusing Republicans of holding the nation hostage. Late-night meetings stretched into dawn. Lawmakers drank endless cups of coffee, their faces weary under the fluorescent lights. Journalists waited outside the committee rooms, ready to report even the faintest hint of progress. But again and again, each session ended in failure. The White House issued statement after statement. President Trump's administration claimed it was ready to negotiate, but only on his terms. He wanted new immigration funding, major spending cuts, and a rollback of healthcare subsidies. Democrats refused, calling it a ransom demand and an attack on working families. Outside Washington, the effects were becoming painful. Farmers in the Midwest couldn't access their federal crop insurance. Fishermen on the coast were losing export permits. Even NASA had suspended several satellite launches, halting millions in contracts. In towns across America, people gathered in bars, diners, and church halls, talking not about sports or movies, but about politics. Everyone had an opinion, and almost no one agreed. It was as if the entire nation had been split into two different realities, each blaming the other for the collapse of government. Meanwhile, the president began floating a new idea: the possible use of the Insurrection Act, a controversial law allowing him to deploy the military within U.S. borders if he believed civil unrest threatened national order. His critics called it a dangerous escalation. Some warned it could set a dark precedent, blurring the line between democracy and authoritarian control. But Trump defended the idea, saying he would do whatever it takes to restore stability and protect the nation's interests. Legal experts immediately challenged the claim, and several state governors vowed to resist any federal interference without consent. Courtrooms prepared for what could become one of the most defining constitutional battles in decades. And so, while the government remained frozen, a new storm began to form, a storm not of budget debates, but of power itself. The morning after President Trump's remarks on the Insurrection Act, the nation woke up uneasy. Cable news screens blazed with red banners, crisis deepens. Commentators debated whether the president truly meant to use military authority within the country, or if it was merely political theater. But whatever the truth, the impact was immediate. Tension spiked, and fear spread. In several major cities, small protests turned into large gatherings. In New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, people carried banners reading, "Democracy, not dictatorship." Chants of anger filled the streets as citizens demanded the government reopen and the Constitution be respected. At the same time, in rural areas and conservative strongholds, Trump supporters held their own rallies, waving flags, defending the president's call for law and order, and accusing the media of spreading lies. The country seemed to be talking past itself, two different Americas, each convinced the other had betrayed the nation. Meanwhile, behind closed doors at the Pentagon, military leaders held urgent meetings. They discussed what their role would be if the president actually invoked the Insurrection Act. Some officers privately expressed concern that the order could blur the boundary between national defense and domestic politics. One general reportedly told colleagues, "Our duty is to the Constitution, not to any individual." Across the river in the Supreme Court, the justices were quietly preparing for a new judicial term. Their upcoming cases touched on voting rights, health care, and federal authority, issues that suddenly felt more explosive than ever. Analysts said the court could soon become the final referee in the growing battle between Congress and the president. Inside the White House, tension ran high. Advisors argued over strategy, some urging the president to compromise, others telling him to double down. Trump paced the halls, visibly frustrated, angry that negotiations were going nowhere while his poll numbers slipped. As night fell over Washington, the Capitol seemed caught between two fears: the fear of a government that had stopped working, and the fear of a leader who might push the limits of his power to make it work again. The city's skyline glowed under a quiet October sky, but beneath the calm surface, America was standing on the edge, uncertain which way it would fall. As the shutdown stretched into its fourth week, America began to feel the weight of paralysis. Airports ran on limited staff, delays became routine, and families waiting for paychecks were slipping into debt. The government, once a symbol of power and reliability, now seemed fragile, uncertain, and distant. On social media, frustration had turned into anger. Videos of unpaid federal workers breaking down in tears went viral. In one clip, a park ranger stood before a locked gate, saying softly, "I've served my country for 20 years. I never thought I'd have to beg to feed my kids." That video sparked national outrage, forcing even lawmakers to face the human cost of their political gridlock. Yet in Congress, little changed. Each side still clung to its demands, each speech sounding more like theater than governance. Meanwhile, economists warned of deeper consequences. The stock market wobbled, consumer spending dropped. The U.S. credit rating, once untouchable, faced review. Foreign investors began to whisper that America's political system was losing its legendary stability. At the same time, international allies were watching closely. European leaders called for calm, but some foreign commentators mocked the situation, saying, "If this is the world's greatest democracy, it's starting to look very tired." Inside the Oval Office, President Trump held a closed-door meeting with top aides. Reports later revealed that his temper had flared. He slammed his hand on the desk and said, "They think I'll fold, I won't. I built an empire by outlasting people. I'll do it again." But behind the confidence, exhaustion was setting in. Advisors described a president under immense pressure, haunted by the fear of appearing weak, yet aware that the nation's patience was fading fast. Meanwhile, a quiet movement was building in the Senate. Moderate Republicans and Democrats began forming a small coalition, aimed at forcing a temporary reopening of the government, with or without the president's approval. It was a bold move, one that could either break the stalemate or trigger a full political showdown inside the Republican Party itself. The days ahead would decide not only the fate of the shutdown, but the strength of American democracy itself. The following week began with a chill in the autumn air, but inside Washington, tempers were still running hot. The political standoff had now turned into a full-scale constitutional confrontation. The president, the Congress, and even the courts were on the verge of colliding, each defending its own vision of power. Early Monday morning, news broke that the Senate coalition, that small, fragile group of moderates, had finalized a temporary funding proposal. The plan was simple: reopen the government for 30 days, give federal workers their pay, and resume negotiations without preconditions. It was, for the first time in weeks, a glimmer of hope. But that hope didn't last long. Within hours, the White House dismissed the proposal outright. Trump's press secretary announced, "The president will not sign any bill that fails to include spending reforms and border funding. This administration stands firm." The rejection hit like a shockwave. Crowds outside the Capitol booed as the announcement spread. In the Senate chamber, several lawmakers slammed their desks in frustration. The fragile unity that had taken weeks to build began to unravel in minutes. By afternoon, television networks were broadcasting live chaos. One Democratic senator shouted that the president is running this country like a business gone bankrupt. A Republican countered, "At least he's trying to fix it, not feed it more debt." The argument spilled into every corner of American life, from classrooms to grocery stores to dinner tables. Meanwhile, deep inside the Pentagon, a very different kind of discussion was unfolding. Officials reviewed what would happen if the shutdown continued indefinitely. How long could critical systems run? How long could troops remain funded? And what to do if key infrastructure began to fail? They called it continuity planning, but to many, it felt like preparing for an emergency no one wanted to name. The world's eyes were locked on America. Foreign markets trembled. International media spoke of a leadership vacuum, and allies wondered if Washington could still be trusted as a stable partner. And then, late that night, in a quiet corner of the Capitol, Senator Maria Thompson, one of the few who still believed in compromise, looked into the camera and said softly, "This isn't about winning or losing anymore. It's about whether America can still govern itself." Her words echoed across the country, landing like a question too painful for anyone to answer. By mid-October, the government shutdown had reached its peak, casting a shadow over the nation's politics, economy, and public life. Federal workers were receiving back pay in some areas, but many services remained delayed or unavailable. The long, tense weeks had left Americans exhausted, frustrated, and anxious. The Senate, after intense negotiations, finally passed a temporary funding bill. The president signed it reluctantly, emphasizing that it was a short-term solution and promising more decisive reforms in the coming months. The government reopened, but the political wounds remained deep. Across the country, citizens reacted with a mixture of relief and wariness. Some cheered the end of the shutdown, grateful to receive paychecks once again. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether their leaders had learned anything from the crisis. The sense of national unity had frayed, leaving a divided America to ponder its future. In Washington, lawmakers returned to their offices with cautious optimism. The media described the week as a fragile victory, while political analysts warned that the underlying disputes over health care, spending, and executive power had not disappeared. The nation had survived the shutdown, but its democratic institutions have been tested like never before. In the Oval Office, President Trump addressed the press one final time, saying, "We have reopened the government, and we will continue to protect the taxpayer. But let me be clear, we cannot allow chaos to dictate our future." As night fell over the Capitol, the city seemed calmer, yet the memory of weeks of gridlock, protests, and uncertainty lingered in every corridor. The shutdown was over, but the lessons it left behind about power, compromise, and responsibility would echo through American politics for years to come. And so, the story of the 2025 U.S. government shutdown ended, not with triumph or defeat, but with a reminder that democracy, while resilient, is never invincible.